Last time we left off at Göbekli Tepe, that place where hunter-gatherers who knew nothing of farming or metals built enormous stone circles carved with wild animals. And then, after 1,000 years, they just buried their temples, covered them with earth and left. And we kept wondering, where did they go? What happened to them? We followed their traces to Navalichori, to Shayonu, to Jericho. We saw how the same symbols, bulls, vultures, snakes, appeared on the walls of houses at Çatalhöyük, how people began living in one place, growing wheat, taming goats and sheep, how they buried their dead right under the floor and covered skulls with plaster, setting them on shelves so ancestors would always be near. And all that time we could only guess. What were they thinking? What did they talk about? What did they believe? Archaeologists gathered this whisper bit by bit from bones, from ashes of ancient fires, from sherds of broken pots. And then something happened that changed everything. Sometime near the end of the 4th millennium before our era, in a city called Uruk, which stood on the banks of the Euphrates where Iraq is today, a person took a lump of wet clay, a pointed stick, and simply pressed it down, left a mark. And from that moment, people began speaking to us themselves, not with voices. We'll never hear what their language sounded like, but we can read what they wrote, lists, accounts, letters, prayers, laws, a whole world that lay underground for 5,000 years and suddenly opened up. This is the story of how the first hand that wrote appeared, and of what life was like in the city where it happened. But to understand how writing appeared, you first need to understand how people counted before it. Because writing wasn't born from a desire to tell stories. It was born from bookkeeping. Imagine you have a farm, a small one, a few sheep, some grain, a couple of jars of oil. You can remember that. Now imagine you don't have a farm, you have a whole temple, hundreds of people, thousands of sheep, mountains of grain, dozens of different goods coming and going every day. How do you not forget anything? How do you check that everything is there? Thousands of years before the first cities appeared, people came up with a simple method. They took clay and molded little shapes from it. Cones, spheres, cylinders, discs, pyramids. Each shape meant something. A cone, one measure of grain. A sphere, another measure larger. A cylinder, a sheep. An oval, a jar of oil. This was the world's first counting tool. Archaeologists find such shapes all over the Near East, starting from the 8th millennium before our era. At Çayonu, for example, there are hundreds. At Çatalhöyük, thousands. But this method had a problem. If you're sending sheep to another city, how does the receiver check that you sent exactly what you said? You could say 5 sheep, but send 4, or the shapes could get lost on the way. So they invented the bulla. A bulla is a clay ball about the size of a fist. You take the shapes that correspond to your goods, put them inside the ball, and seal it. On top, while the clay is still wet, you roll your personal seal, a carved stone cylinder. You get a contract in clay that can't be faked and can't be opened without breaking. Such bullae are found in the same layers as the shapes. At Susa in Iran there are many, at Uruk too. And then one day, someone had a simple idea. Why mold a ball and hide the shapes inside every time if you could just press those shapes into the surface while the clay is still wet? Take a cone, press it, you get a circle. Roll a cylinder, an oval mark. Now, without breaking the ball, anyone can see what's inside. This was the first step from counting toward writing. Archaeologists find such bullae with impressions. They date to around 3,700 to 3,500 before our era. A transitional moment when the shapes are still inside. but they've already been duplicated on the outside. Then someone took the next step. Why use shapes at all if I have their impressions? You could just press a stick into the clay, mimicking the shape of a cone or sphere. So impressions became signs drawn by hand, and the shapes were no longer needed. The first tablets where drawings replaced shapes were found in the same Uruk layers, around 3,200 before our era, 4,000 tablets and fragments, and almost all of them are just administrative records. How much grain, how much oil, how many sheep, how many workers, how many rations. Not a single poem, not a single prayer. Just bookkeeping. Dull, grey, household bookkeeping. But this is where the written history of humanity began. Now let's look at the city where this happened. Uruk. Uruk is the ancient name. Today this place is called Warka. German archaeologists have been excavating it for over 100 years, since 1912, with interruptions but still going. The oldest layers of Uruk go back to the 6th millennium before our era. Still the Copper Age. But we're interested in the time roughly from 3,500 to 3,000 before our era. The period archaeologists call the Uruk period. This is when something incredible happened here. In the Uruk excavations, archaeologists find the same type of bowl again and again. They call them beveled rim bowls. What are these bowls like? About as tall as a hand, about 18 centimeters wide. The base is distinct, the walls are thick and crude, completely undecorated, made from simple clay mixed with plant temper, poorly fired. They look ugly, but they were made by the millions. One such bowl is now in the British Museum in London. It was found in Iraq at a mound called Tel Abu Dahir. Inside, a lump of bitumen even survived. Ancient pitch used to seal cracks. You can see this bowl wasn't for beauty, it was for use. Such bowls are found all over the Near East, in the mountains of Iran, in Syria, and even on the coast of Pakistan. Everywhere the same size, same shape. Scholars long debated how they were made. They tried shaping by hand. It came out crooked, not like the ancient ones. They tried using a mold, wooden, or just a hollow, scooped in the ground to press clay into. That came out close. Now most lean toward the mold theory. Why were they made in such quantities? The simplest answer: they were ration bowls. Hundreds of people worked in the temple households of Uruk. They needed to be fed and paid for their labor. There was no money back then. They were paid in food. Barley was scooped into such a bowl, beer or oil poured in, and given to the worker. One worker, one bowl, fair, equal. The bowl was used once or twice and discarded. That's why they're found in whole piles. Now remember the little shapes we talked about in the last chapter. A cone, one measure of grain. A sphere, another measure. A cylinder, a sheep. This isn't just abstraction. These are real portions given to real people in real bowls. And when the temple accountant pressed a stick into clay, he wasn't drawing a hieroglyph. He was counting rations. Writing was born from accounting, from the desire to shortchange no one and forget nothing. But in Uruk, they didn't just count grain. They also built, and they built like no one had built before. In the center of the city, where a mound called Iana stands today, archaeologists found remains of enormous buildings. The most impressive are the so-called temples on terraces. These weren't just houses for gods, but entire architectural complexes on high platforms. Walls were decorated with mosaics made of clay cones, painted red, black, and white. The cones were pressed into wet plaster so tightly that they formed continuous patterns. Diamonds, triangles, zigzags. One such temple, which archaeologists named the Red Temple, was decorated with thousands of these cones. When sunlight hit them, the walls shimmered like modern mosaic, and this was 3,000 years before our era. A German archaeological expedition led by Julius Jordan found these structures in the 1930s. They lay under multiple meters of sand and clay. What opened up before the archaeologists was breathtaking. Walls preserved up to 3 meters high. In some places, traces of paint even remained. Near the temples, they found workshops, storage rooms, pottery kilns. The city lived, breathed, worked. In 2025, just recently, archaeologists from the University of Coimbra were digging in Iraqi Kurdistan at a mound called Kani Shahi, and they found a monumental Uruk period building there, dating to around 3,300 to 3,100 before our era. The walls of this building were decorated with exactly the same clay cones as in Uruk. They also found a fragment of a gold pendant and a cylinder seal. This means that even distant settlements were in backwaters. They participated in a shared system, copied Uruk models, possibly even submitted to Uruk's authority. This was no longer just a village, but a whole network of settlements connected by trade and possibly political power. Uruk's most famous find isn't bowls or temples. It's a face. In 1939, German archaeologists were digging in the Iana district, in the very heart of the city. They found a marble female head, about life-size. Today it's known as the Mask of Warka, or the Lady of Uruk. It dates to around 3,100 before our era. The eyes and eyebrows were inlaid, probably with lapis lazuli and shell. The statue itself, of which this head was part, was made of wood and hasn't survived, but the face remained. It's remarkable. Soft, rounded cheeks, lips, nose, combined with abstract geometric eyebrows, a style mixing realism and convention. This is one of the first known representations of a human face approaching reality, not a schema, not a symbol, but an attempt to capture a living expression. Today, this head is in the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad. It was lucky. It survived the war, the museum looting in 2003, and was later returned. Sometimes it travels to exhibitions. Last time it was in Paris in 2024. Scholars believe this represents the goddess Inanna, Uruk's main deity. Inanna is the goddess of love and war, the morning and evening star, the planet Venus. Her cult would later pass through millennia, to the Akkadians as Ishtar, to the Phoenicians as Astarte, to the Greeks as Aphrodite. But the first form we know is this one, from Uruk, with the marble face and inlaid eyes that once looked down on the city from the temple height. Now, let's go back to those tablets we started with. In Uruk's level 4 layers, the same ones where beveled rim bowls and clay cones were found, the tablets lay as well. Small, palm-sized, slightly convex on one side and flat on the other. On them, drawings made with a pointed stick, pictographs. Next to the drawings, little circles, number signs. On one tablet, a head and a bowl are drawn. On another, a sheep and several strokes. On a third, something like a pot and more strokes. These aren't texts in our understanding, they're just lists. In 1928, a German expedition led by Julius Jordan found the first such tablets. They lay mixed with ash and potsherds, apparently just thrown away after use. But for archaeologists, this was a world-class discovery. About 4,000 such tablets and fragments have been found. The oldest date to around 3,200 before our era. These are the oldest written texts in the world. One text lists 120 officials, the city leader, supervisors of plows, supervisors of lambs, plus separate terms for priests, metalsmiths, and potters. Society was already clearly structured. Someone herds sheep, someone makes pots, someone counts, someone commands. And almost all the texts are administrative records. Not a single poem, not a single prayer, not a single myth. Only accounting. But several more centuries would pass, and the first literary texts would appear. The most famous of them is the Epic of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, a story of friendship, death, the search for immortality. A story that would be rewritten and retold for 1,000 years, from Sumerians to Akkadians, from Babylonians to Assyrians, until it spread across the entire Near East. But Gilgamesh is still far away. For now, there's only bookkeeping, boring lists of grain and sheep, and this is where history begins, the kind we can now read with our own eyes. We've traveled a long road, from the first clay shapes that people molded 8,000 years ago at Chayonu and Çatalhöyük to remember things, to the clay boule where these shapes were hidden, to impressions of shapes on the surface of the boule, to the first drawings with a stick on clay, and finally, to the first real texts found by German archaeologists at Uruk in the late 1920s. All this happened in one place, in one city, over a few hundred years. Uruk wasn't the only city in Mesopotamia. Nearby stood Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. Things were happening in each of them too. But Uruk was the place where it all came together, where mass production, standardization, accounting, and writing first appeared, where a management system first developed, capable of feeding thousands of people and forgetting nothing. Archaeologists call this the Uruk expansion. At the end of the 4th millennium before our era, objects of Uruk culture, those same beveled rim bowls, cylinder seals, even architectural techniques like clay cone mosaics, spread across the entire Near East, from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean, from Anatolia to Egypt. Some talk of trade, some of colonization, some of cultural influence, but the fact remains, Uruk changed the world around it. And then, around 3,000 years before our era, Uruk gradually lost its importance. The city wasn't destroyed, wasn't burned. The center of power just shifted. Other cities came to the fore, Ur, Lagash, Kish. But writing, once it appeared, remained. The idea of recording information on clay would never disappear. And everything that was written down back then became the beginning of the world we live in now. We know that in Uruk they worshipped the goddess Inanna. Her face, that same marble mask in the National Museum of Iraq, looked down on the city from the temple height. Her cult wouldn't disappear with Uruk. It would pass to the Akkadians as Ishtar, to the Phoenicians as Astarte, to the Greeks as Aphrodite. But the roots of all this are here, in the clay tablets and temple storerooms of Uruk. Several more centuries would pass, and the first literary texts would appear in these same lands. The most famous of them is the Epic of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. A story of friendship, death, the search for immortality. A story that would be rewritten and retold for 1,000 years, from Sumerians to Akkadians, from Babylonians to Assyrians, until it spread across the entire Near East. Have you heard of Gilgamesh? Oh, that's a special story. Gilgamesh. Ziggurats. Gods demanding sacrifices and sending floods if something displeases them. The story continues.